The desert sun hammered the dunes, turning the sand into a blinding white glare. Joseph stood still, but his brothers were already moving. Shadows stretched long and jagged across the earth. Without a single word, they closed the distance. Hands grabbed him. The struggle was short, brutal, and finished in seconds. They dragged him toward the mouth of a jagged pit and shoved. Air rushed past him as he fell, hitting the stone floor with a bone-jarring thud. Dust billowed, choking his lungs and stinging his eyes. He scrambled to his feet, clawing at the cold, damp walls. But the ground beneath him was slick and uneven. Above, the patch of daylight was a shrinking, distant pinprick. He watched the silhouettes of his brothers block the sun, then shift, then vanish entirely. The heavy silence of the cistern settled in, thick and absolute. He pulled his knees to his chest, the damp earth leaching the heat from his skin. He stared into the blackness, listening to the sound of his own pulse, while the whole above remained as indifferent as the sky. He was alone in the dark. Years passed in the shadow of a new master. Within the sprawling estate, Joseph moved with rhythmic, surgical precision. He organized the vast granaries, mapping every grain and every vessel, his face a mask of absolute focus. The estate hummed under his command, yet the silence of the corridors held a different kind of pressure. One afternoon, in a dim, narrow passage, the master's wife stepped from the shadows. She blocked his path, her movements deliberate and slow. She reached out, her fingers catching his arm with a grip that tightened as he stepped back. He did not speak. He did not bargain. He twisted his body, muscles straining against her hold, and wrenched himself free with a sudden, violent jolt. The fabric gave way under the force of his movement. He did not look back. He sprinted toward the far end of the hall, toward the blinding white light of the courtyard. He left the remainder of his hold in her hands. The decision was made in a heartbeat, a desperate trade of safety for integrity. He reached the threshold of the garden just as the heavy doors behind him slammed shut, sealing his fate and pushing him toward the cold, iron reality of the prison gates. The prison air tasted of wet stone, mold, and rusted iron. It was a suffocating, windowless box where sunlight never reached. Joseph sat in the furthest corner, his spine pressed hard against the damp wall. He watched the flicker of a distant torch, his eyes tracking the light as it danced across the ceiling. He did not weep, he did not call out. Instead, he listened. He heard the rhythmic scratching of rats, the erratic breathing of men in the dark, and the low, jagged whispers of those who had long ago lost their hope. He mapped their fears, categorized their secrets, and built a mental grid of the misery surrounding him. One night, he stood. His joints ached, but his movements were fluid. He walked to the heavy iron gate and reached through the bars, offering a piece of bread to a man who was shaking in the dark. The man did not speak, but he stopped trembling. Joseph returned to his corner and closed his eyes. He stopped reacting to the environment and started analyzing it. He built a fortress of logic within the silence, turning the damp cell into a command center. He was no longer a prisoner of the walls. He was the warden of the shadows. The transition was brutal. The guards dragged him from the damp dark into a world of blinding, golden brilliance. They pushed him onto the polished stone floor of the throne room. Joseph did not stumble. He rose, his presence steady against the towering pillars that seemed to hold up the sky itself. Pharaoh sat on the throne, gesturing to a mural etched into the wall. 7 fat cows, 7 thin, 7 ears of corn, 7 withered stalks. Silence pressed down on the room, heavy and expectant. Joseph stepped forward. He did not bow or hesitate. He pointed to the images, his voice ringing out with the clarity of a sharpened blade. He mapped out the years of harvest and the ensuing famine, laying them out as a strategic timeline. He spoke of storage, of rationing, and of the survival of the state. The court held its collective breath. Pharaoh's expression shifted, the arrogance replaced by a cold, calculating respect. In a single moment, the dynamic of the room inverted. The prisoner became the architect. The ruler descended from his dais, gesturing to the expanse of the land beyond the windows. Joseph was no longer a captive. He was the primary mind of the empire, tasked with building the silos that would save a nation from the coming dust. In the quiet of his study, Joseph held a length of frayed, weathered rope in one hand and a heavy, polished gold ring in the other. He traced the rough, biting texture of the hemp, remembering the bite of the pit and the grit of the prison floor. Then he shifted his grip to the cool, unyielding metal of the ring, the symbol of his current command. He did not see them as opposites. He saw them as the two halves of a single path. He spoke into the stillness, his voice low and deliberate. A man remains a slave to his history until he masters the architecture of his own spirit. He set the items down, their weight settling into the wood of the desk. The struggle had not been against brothers, or masters, or kings. It had been against the chaos of his own reactions. He walked to the high balcony. The desert wind pulled at him, carrying the scent of dry earth and distance. He looked out over the endless golden expanse, his gaze fixed on the exact point where the desert met the sky. There was no more fear. There was no more desire for vengeance. There was only the horizon and the steady, rhythmic pulse of a mind that had finally found its silence.